Hey everyone, welcome to the Students and Police Interactions panel event. We've got here with us three talented lawyers to go through policing and your right to students with us tonight. I'll let them do their own introduction. So Sam, would you like to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for inviting me. And my name's Sam Lee. I'm a senior solicitor at Redfern Legal Centre in the police accountability practice.
Thanks for inviting me as well. My name is Jason Teo. I'm the youth solicitor at Marrickville Legal Centre. I work with the Youth Legal Service, where we assist young people living anywhere in New South Wales with a range of legal issues. I also go out to court regularly as a duty lawyer at Burwood and Sutherland Court to assist with criminal matters.
So my name is Linda. I am one of the two lawyers with ARC's Legal and Advocacy Service. So we're the free service on campus for all currently enrolled UNSW students.
So Sam, what do you think are the biggest rights or just things that students should know generally when it comes to dealing with police?
Yeah, so I think it's really important when dealing with police is to know that their powers are limited, that the powers are limited by legislation and by what we call case law. So they don't exist in a vacuum and they must adhere to all these types of regulations of their powers. Some tips that we give people in terms of if they have an interaction with police is one, to be cooperative, because if you don't, things can get worse. To ask them to turn on their body-worn video footage, which all police in uniform are meant to have on them. And what's really important is that if police ask to search you, the only words you really need to say to police is that I don't consent. If that's the only words you can get out, it's really important. So I don't consent, please turn on your body-worn video footage. I won't say too much because I think it just gets lost. You get very intimidated by police when they're in front of you holding guns. But if you can remember, I don't consent, turn on your body-worn video footage, then that will assist, if not at that time, later when you go speak to a lawyer.
Wow.
Yeah, so unfortunately it's still discretionary whether police turn on the footage, but obviously if you ask them, they really should turn it on.
The other thing, if I can also add, is if, for example, the police officers are not in uniform and they don't have body-worn video, you can use your mobile phone to record that interaction with the police. Or, if you were with a group of mates, if you see that your mates are in trouble, feel free to record the incident. There is an app available. It's called Cop Watch. Basically, it allows you to press a button to record that interaction with the police, and it gets stored on the cloud, so it can't be deleted. I think that's really, really useful to ensure accountability. And if something goes wrong, there's a clear record of what really transpired.
Just a little proviso though with the mobile phones. If you do have a friend, it is better to say to them to move away from the scenario and try and film it, because if you do sometimes put a mobile phone in front of police, they will confiscate it and you've lost your iPhone 13 for possibly a few weeks. So yeah, just be careful when you're filming police.
What are sort of the most common ways students come into contact with police, or what are the most common ways that students can get in trouble with them?
So police are generally concerned with criminal law. Often a person's first interaction is because they may have committed an offense. This could be for something relatively minor. People often think of what's called penalty notices offenses, such as driving offenses or a public transport fine. But people can also come into contact with police because of other reasons. So if they're driving, the police could stop someone to perform a random breath test. Sometimes, there is a sort of domestic disturbance, a report has been made, and police attend the scene to investigate, or police may have observed someone committing an offense or acting in a way that is that police considers suspicious, but it has to satisfy the correct legal criteria. Police may also want to speak to students. For example, if they witness a criminal offense, they may want to get a statement of that person. However, as Sam outlined earlier on, that while the police have additional powers beyond that of a regular person, the law requires the police to comply with some of the safeguards. What that means is if police do the wrong thing, the police could also potentially get into trouble. So for example, just because someone is in an area with known drug activity is not legally enough for the police to search them.
Do you sort of know any ways that students can avoid coming into contact with police?
Knowing your rights. I'm a big believer in knowledge being power, and knowing what the limits of the police are, knowing what you can and can't do in certain situations. I had no idea you could say, turn on your body cam footage. No idea. And I've been practicing law for a very long time. So I think just knowing what you can and can't do in a situation, and knowing if things start to go wrong, great, pull out your mobile phone, have your friends stand far away and start recording is really important, just in case something does go wrong, and it's maybe contact that where you haven't done anything wrong, and then you've got that ability to later to make your complaint, to fight a charge, and all of those things.
You decline a search or answering questions, and I guess, you know, even if you are maybe technically allowed to do so, is it recommended, or could it be a bad idea?
Yeah, so let's just take the scenario that you're walking down the street and a cop comes up to you and says, hey, so what are you doing down here? Can I look in your bag? And you absolutely don't have to answer any questions, or you do not have to consent to a search. The problem is that police are very good and trained to engage people in conversation. And it's very easy to be drifted down the path of consenting to police opening your bag. So again, police are limited by legislation, and there are only certain times or facts that have to be present that allow police to search an individual. So if you're just going along the street, as I said, then no, you don't have to answer any questions. And you should, as I said before, say to police, I do not consent to a search. Now, the search may continue anyway, regardless of what you say to police. But if police find nothing and it's been recorded that you were searched, then that search could be unlawful. And you then could have a potential to sue police for that unlawful search. Really quickly, though, I should also point out that if you're under 18 years of age, or if you're Aboriginal, which we'll get into a bit later, there are other safeguards that also come into play around questioning by police.
Can police access your phone, sort of compel you to unlock it, that kind of thing?
I think the starting point is to understand that the police, while they are allowed to search a person without a warrant, they can only do so in very limited circumstances. In relation to accessing a person's phone, they can seize and detain your phone if the legal standard is where the police suspects on reasonable grounds that the phone is either stolen, that the phone has or will be used in committing an offense, or if the phone contains evidence of an offense being committed. So a number of ways that can happen. If you think police is going to be seizing or detaining your phone, the best thing you can do is to ensure that your phone is locked, that your phone has a passcode before the police gets their hands on your phone. And the reason for it is, unless the police have got a court order, they cannot force you to disclose your password. They can't force you to unlock your phone. What I think can also be useful is to turn off the face recognition feature on your phone, because some cheeky police officers will point the screen of your phone at your face to get the phone to unlock. That's sort of a gray area. So just to avoid problems, PIN-based passcodes is probably the way to go.
To add on there, that sometimes phones are confiscated by police because someone is filming them, even just a witness filming them. I want to make it clear that you are legally allowed to film police in public places. And if your phone is confiscated while you're filming the police, then that is unlawful. And it is not allowed for police to do that.
What are the consequences for international students if they get in trouble with police? Is it different from domestic students at all?
It can be different. There are some crimes that when they go on someone's criminal record, it can actually affect a visa, and it can impact, it can breach visa conditions. Off the top of my head, I don't know what those are, but they're more serious crimes, generally where there's a jail sentence attached. Things like traffic fines or move along directions, or kind of just general interactions where you might get stopped or just asked for, name and address and those kind of things. They are not going to impact, but definitely being arrested, it could. And at that point, that's when you would get advice about how it could actually breach visa.
Yes, I understand. If you are convicted of an offence and get a sentence, an imprisonment sentence of 12 months or more, then there is potential to be deported in regards to that offence. But something international students should be aware of is that police are required, if you don't speak English or your English is limited, then they are required to get an interpreter, even if they're on the street, and provide access to an interpreter. So you shouldn't be disadvantaged in terms of understanding what police are asking of you because your English is limited.
Could I refuse to show my ID to police if they ask for it?
Yes, you can. There are certain circumstances where police can demand ID and you are required to provide it, but they're very limited circumstances. For example, if you're driving a car, you are, when pulled over by police, required to show your licence. If you're a witness to a serious offence, then you would be required to provide your name to police. But no one in Australia is required to carry around ID and produce it on demand. So the answer generally is no, you don't have to provide ID except in very limited circumstances. However, in some circumstances, if police are hassling you and there's nothing really serious pending, then you've got to weigh up the circumstances and think whether it's just okay to provide your name and address, for example, that you're a witness to a crime or something like that.
I think sometimes on a practical level, it may be useful to think about giving your ID to the police. For example, if you've committed like a relatively minor offense, and the reason being the police officer, they've got a lot of discretion. They can issue people with a caution, a penalty notice, or they can charge someone in court. And often if they don't know who you are, they can't issue a penalty notice, and that can make things worse.
Say, worst comes to worst, I'm taken into custody. So sort of what's the point of view? What happens next? Where do they take me? And what should I do? Like, should I call anyone or that kind of thing?
When someone arrests a person, they will be taken to the police station. They'll be placed in police custody. The police may want to speak to the person, may ask the person if they want to participate in an interview. And generally, the next step would be for the police to figure out whether a person is going to be let out on bail. Now, what bail means is the person is they're allowed to be in the community while they're processed through the criminal legal system, while before the court decides whether the person is guilty or not guilty, and before the court decides what the appropriate sentence is. Everyone has the presumption of innocence. So until you go before the court, until you are found guilty, there is a presumption of innocence. So with most relatively minor offenses, a person should be released on bail. There are, however, some circumstances where people are not being granted police bail. And what they really should be thinking of doing is to speak to a legal aid lawyer. Legal aid may be able to assist with it's called a release application. It's an application before a local court magistrate who would review the circumstances and decide whether or not to grant a person bail.
In terms of when you are arrested, because I tried looking for it today and I couldn't find it anywhere. In terms of the phone call, is there a limit on how many phone calls someone in custody is allowed to make?
Well, it's not specific like that. You are allowed to contact, say, a support person, and you are allowed to contact your lawyer. So, for example, you can't contact your lawyer on one number, you try another number. So there's no limit on the actual phone call. So I'm sure police say, well, that's enough. It's more about who you're allowed to contact.
What effect does a criminal record have on me?
It can stop certain things happening. So for example, if you ever need a gun license or to be a security guard, it can prevent you getting things like that. It will show up on police checks and working with children checks, so it might stop you getting opportunities. In some cases, having a criminal record can actually stop you from traveling. There are some countries that will not allow you entry, for example, Canada. And I know you have to disclose in America and some other countries whether you have a criminal record. So it can actually have wider reaching implications that you haven't really thought of before.
Yeah, look, I think it's important to note that there's two different records. There's a criminal record and a traffic record. So, for example, if you're charged with speeding, that doesn't go on a criminal record. If you're charged with parking in an illegal spot, that doesn't go on a criminal record, it goes on a traffic record. And they're not the same thing. So don't panic if you've obtained some fines, for example. And if you do have a criminal record and they're not serious offences, for example, they're not violent offences and they're low-level offences, it does take a while, but after 10 years, you can have that record, what's called spent, so that offence removed.
The other thing I want to say is while having a criminal record may limit a person's opportunities to volunteer, work, study, or travel, that clearly results in a person being treated differently because of a certain attribute. This does not always amount to a breach in anti-discrimination laws. Say, for example, when it comes to employment, the law requires employers to consider whether the conviction or the offense itself has any bearing to the inherent requirements of the role. And only if this has some kind of relevance can the employee be treated differently. So an example I can provide here is where someone receives a conviction for shoplifting or larceny, they may have trouble getting a job where integrity is vital, such as where they want to work in a bank or work in any sort of role which involves money. But if it's something that's completely irrelevant, you've went through a red light and you're trying to apply for a job at a bank, that really should have no bearing on it at all.
Under what sort of circumstances will police actually be allowed to arrest me? Are they required to go through any processes like cautions or anything before arrest?
So let's go back to when an officer can arrest you. So again, we go back to legislation and case law that governs this action. So police have to meet what we call a legal threshold to arrest you. And that legal threshold is that there is reasonable suspicion on reasonable grounds that you have committed an offence. Now, these are very technical terms, but basically summing it up, they need more than just a mere possibility that you've done something, but it must be based on some kind of fact. As Jason touched upon earlier, we know things that aren't sufficient to arrest you. For example, if you're just in a drug-known suburb with high drug prevalence, then that's not enough to arrest you. If you're out late at night, say 2 o'clock in the morning, that itself in a dark place, or that in itself is not enough to arrest you. Just because you're of a certain racial background, that is not in itself enough to arrest you. So it has to be based on some facts that there's a possibility, well, there's a factors that when put together mean that there is a reasonable grounds that you have committed an offence. An important thing to remember is that arrest should be a last resort, an absolute last resort, and shouldn't be the first port of call. And again, there are legal thresholds that police must meet in order to decide to arrest you. For example, they are of the view that you're about to commit another offence, or that you're about to flee from a crime. As I said, there are legal thresholds they need to meet. So it can't just happen out of the blue. If they do decide to arrest you, then yes, they must provide a caution. They must provide reasons as to why they're arresting you, and they should provide their name and the place where they work. So there are some safeguards that come into play in regards to arrest. A point to make also, if you're a young person under the age of 18, then they are meant to refer to what's called the Youth Offenders Act. And what that can do is that instead of arresting you, they can give you a caution as an option.
Can you give any advice on music festivals and anything to know there?
Police frequently use, if you've been to a music festival, you will notice that police often use drug detection dogs or sniffer dogs at festivals. Basically, they're there to try to detect people who may be in possession of illegal drugs. How it's important to note that just because a dog indicates that someone may have something on them does not give the police an automatic right to search a person. The law still requires the police to meet that legal threshold. They've still got to be satisfied on reasonable grounds that you have in your possession a prohibited drug or plant. Often when people think of drugs, drug law, when police think something is going on, they're going to have a chat with that person. They're going to ask the person if they have done any drugs recently or if they have any drugs on them. The best thing to do is to go no comment, because sometimes the police may not have met that legal threshold. And by saying that, you have drugs on you, you recently used drugs, that could be used to justify a subsequent search.
Under what circumstances will police actually be allowed to strip search me generally? And what's the level of invasiveness of the search?
In terms of a strip search, the first question is what really constitutes a strip search? A strip search is any sort of, it doesn't have to refer to an examination, or doesn't just refer to an examination of a person's body, but it involves sort of any sort of scenario where a person's clothing is removed. So with strip searches, they are the most sort of extreme violation into a person's dignity, and it should really be used in the most serious or urgent circumstances. Given the invasiveness, that there are very strict safeguards in place, they really shouldn't be done in a public place. If done in a public place, the police have to consider the privacy of the person involved. They've got to think of, they've got to also ensure that no person of the opposite gender or people whose presence is not necessary for the search is there. There are a number of other rules, especially if the person is young, a child under the age of 18.
And just to add to that, for a strip search, they are not allowed to touch your body whatsoever. They can ask you to remove clothing, but they are not allowed to touch the body. They can also ask you to shake your hair and open your mouth so they can look inside the mouth. But again, they're not allowed to touch their body. And a strip search could also be where a police officer looks down the top of a person, not actually ask them to take off any clothes, but actually looks down into their breast or chest area, or pulls down or pulls out, I should say, the back of someone's tracky pants or tights and looks down into the bottom or private parts area, then that also could constitute a strip search. Just to promote here that Redfern Legal Centre and probably Marrickville as well has many fact sheets about police powers, including strip searches. So just go to our website. We're not going to cover everything tonight, but there is a lot of fact sheets on our website.
I'm at a rally and I'm nervous of the large police presence. Should I be worried? Do they have any special powers there?
And I don't think that anyone should be worried about a police presence in kind of normal circumstances. If you're at a rally or at a protest that you believe in the cause, I wouldn't let that deter you. Everyone has a right to protest and freedom of political communication. It's one of the few rights that we have in Australia. There are greater powers where there's large scale, and the words used are public disorder in a public place. So where there's a real risk to safety. And probably the most likely example of that would be like where there's either the threat or actual riots happening. I don't know if anybody watching is old enough to remember the Cronulla riots way back when, but new laws were introduced to kind of deal with those events. They're probably, the powers are used, I'm going to assume even when, let's use rallies, haven't quite hit that definition. I'm sure that Sam and Jason have had people involved at kind of demonstrations and things where those powers have been used. So basically police have kind of wider use of, they can ask you to leave the area, they can stop and search you, they can request ID. So it's kind of exceptions to some of those things that we've already discussed. But unless it's, kind of hit that level, I don't think that anybody should be worried. If you're aware of your own conduct, if you're not carrying drugs, because those sniffer dogs are becoming more and more prevalent. If you're not doing anything wrong and, there's no violence, there's no vandalism, there's no obstructing traffic or hindering kind of other people's movements, everything should be okay. I would just, and I'm going to kind of go into mum mode. I think being really conscious and aware of your surroundings and maybe other people's conduct, because you might have the intention of a peaceful protest, everyone else might not have the intention. So if you notice or if you're feeling like things could go a little bit haywire, if some people are a little bit more passionate than others, you might want to make the assessment about whether it's actually safe to stay at that event. So I think keeping yourself safe is a number one priority, and also again just remembering the rights and the limits, and if you need to protect yourself in filming or asking police to identify themselves or turn on their body cam, all those things that we've talked about. I think that everybody should be able to participate in those types of events.
Say I'm a student of indigenous background. Is there anything I should be particularly aware of when dealing with police?
Yeah, unfortunately, people who are Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander are disproportionately impacted by policing, are disproportionately arrested and stopped and searched by police. So there are some legal safeguards in place that police are required to follow in regards to someone who is Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. It really does, though, come into play if you're arrested. So if you are arrested, then you are required to be given access to Aboriginal Legal Service lawyer. If you're considered a vulnerable person, so if you're being questioned, you must have a support person present at the police station before police can question you. So I guess there's not a lot of safeguards in comparison to how many people are arrested, but those are the two main ones. And I think it's important to note that it's really important to speak to an Aboriginal legal service lawyer before speaking to police, and don't say anything to police until you've spoken to that lawyer.
Is there anything I should know about what rights I have with respect of them?
The criminal law is primarily concerned with possession of illegal drugs and supply of illegal drugs. Drugs that were obtained without a prescription is also illegal. So staying away from illegal drugs is probably the best advice a person can receive to avoid getting into trouble with the law. However, hypothetically, if a person intends to use anyway, say at a festival, the first thing I'll say is they should only bring what they need. They shouldn't bring tablets for their friends because they can also be charged with supply. The best thing to do is to try to keep the tablets in your hand. If you see police or a drug dog approaching, you can consume the tablets. As far as the police is concerned, it's Panadol, whatever it may be. It is only an offense to have drugs in your system when you are driving. So once the person consumes the drugs, and if they're not driving, it can be difficult for police to charge them with an offense such as possession.
It's just, I think it's a valid point that, if you are at, for example, at a music festival or even just somewhere and you've got drugs or you've taken drugs, the most important thing is to put your health first. A lot of people are scared of getting in trouble if they approach police. The most important thing is to ring a friend or tell a friend who's next to you that you're not feeling well and get to a hospital as soon as possible. And just to point out, if you're being charged for having marijuana on you and it's your first offence, it's a low level amount of marijuana, then the law does require police to consider just giving you a caution first, rather than taking you to court.
Say, no, I'm a student. I'd like to make a complaint about police conduct. Where can I go to report this? What sort of action can be taken on my complaint?
Yeah, so I'll just step back. If something has happened with police and you think it might be unlawful or it's caused you trauma, what you should do initially is to that very day or the next day is write down what happened, the date, the time, the location, and just in point form what happened and what the police said to you. What I would then do is contact either Linda or a community legal centre or legal aid and ask to speak to a lawyer, and they'll give you a free advice session. What we need to determine from that session is whether you have a complaint and whether you have a complaint or a possibility to sue the police for what happened. If it's a complaint, you can complain directly to the New South Wales Police, and they do have a portal on their website, or you can lodge a complaint with what's called the Police Watchdog, independent body from police called the LEC, the Law Enforcement Conduct Commission. It's important, as Jason pointed out earlier on in this seminar, that police, if they do the wrong thing, you can claim for damages. So, for example, just say I was on the street, I was arrested for no reason, taken into custody. In custody, I was strip searched. All of those factors can constitute what we call a tort. So a tort is that you've been assaulted by police, you've been detained unlawfully, there's been a trespass to the person, And that's where you can take civil action for damages against police. So I guess the takeaway is if something has happened to you, reach out, write it down, and get some advice.
What are some do's and don'ts if I get pulled over?
I think police can be quite intimidating. So as hard as it is, try not to swear at police. Try not to tell the police to F off, because people who swear at police at a public place are probably going to make things worse. The police may also charge them with an additional offense of offensive language. Given that police have a considerable amount of discretion in dealing with matters, being nice and polite will generally result in better outcomes, where a person is more likely to receive a caution than be charged with an offense. The legal rules around police powers can be really, really complex. Even if you think that the police were not acting appropriately, I don't generally think that it's the right place and time to sort of fight back or disobey any sort of directions by the police. Of course, make it clear that you do not consent. And then the best thing to do is to speak to a lawyer after that to explore if the police have indeed done something wrong. If only more people do that, the police would be more accountable and they'll be more likely to do the right thing.
Can I just add to that? If anything has happened to you in terms of force, it's also really important to take photos of any injuries and to go to your GP or medical practitioner as soon as possible, just so you have some written documentation of that injury.
Are police allowed to use tricks when questioning me or lie to me in any way?
Police in New South Wales, that blew my mind. They've got a code of conduct that all police officers have to abide. It's part of being employed as a police officer. And part of that code is to behave honestly and treating everyone with fairness. So technically, no, they're not allowed. But I think realistically, it happens in every profession. You know, in lawyers, we have a code as well. And sometimes some lawyers follow that code and sometimes they don't. So look, realistically, I think that it can happen. And the law actually recognises that it happens. There's parts of the Evidence Act that says where police have improperly obtained, so maybe it was an illegally searched or they've induced someone to say something by lying to them, that evidence can't be used. So there are those protections for when that does happen. I think the best advice in dealing with police, not swearing at them is great, but also remembering your right to silence. And just keeping in mind that, yes, they kind of have an objective to get information from you. So remembering that you don't have to answer questions except where you have to kind of provide that ID information, name and address in those circumstances that Sam outlined earlier. They can try to trick you. They could try to lie to you. Don't say anything until you've gotten advice. And if they do, make a complaint.
Will factors like not having a definite long-term address or independence from my parents affect me when dealing with police, like for getting bail or anything like that?
Yeah, the only time it really comes into play is if you're seeking bail, or as Jason touched upon, if they're considering their discretion to issue you a fine. If you've got no place of address, then very difficult to issue a fine, although they can give you an on-the-spot fine, but that can't be processed through revenue because there's no address. Yeah, for bail, if you've been arrested and you're seeking bail, it can be a condition that you provide a place of residence. However, I have represented people that haven't had a place of residence at the time of seeking bail. And sometimes the court will give them 24 hours to provide the court with an address. So depends on the judge, but there is a little bit of leeway around that issue because it's quite difficult. You know, some people are homeless or they're in between places because of domestic violence, or they're young and they're not feeling safe at home or whatever. Not having a residence in itself in itself should not be enough to not grant someone bail.
When police compel me to move on from a place, do I have to listen to them?
This relates to sort of move on directions by the police. The police can do so in limited circumstances, such as where someone's obstructing traffic. The police can direct them to move on and not obstruct traffic, or if the person is engaging in behavior that harasses or intimidates someone else, or is in a certain area just for the sole purpose of sort of supply or obtaining illegal drugs. The other sort of common move on directions that people are sort of more familiar with is given to an intoxicated person. The person may be given a move on direction, say for 6 hours. They're not allowed to come back to an area, especially if the person is not just drunk, but also disorderly and they are sort of a public safety risk. In relation to whether you have to listen to a move on direction, if the direction is valid, you have to comply with the direction unless you have a reasonable excuse. If you fail to comply with the direction, the police will probably issue you with a penalty notice or a fine. And if that continues, they'll probably end up charging a person with an offense in court.
If police are knocking on my door, do I have to let them in?
In general, no. There are some situations where they can come in without your permission. So if they have a search warrant, which is basically permission from the court saying that they're allowed to enter the premises, if they're there to arrest someone that they believe might be in the property or in an emergency situation, so if they hear screaming from the outside, typically STV situations, they can enter, but in all other circumstances, no, you don't have to let the police in and you don't have to speak to them.
What's your advice on social media? Can police go through it?
Yeah, it comes back a bit to Jason's question around mobile phones. As Jason pointed out, there is a number of powers police have to search and seize items or property, and that could include computers. There's no specific power to examine data, and that is a bit of a grey area and one that's developing mainly through cases that are coming before the courts. There have been some cases where police have been through the court, have won that they could look at social media, especially when they're trying to find someone that may be a victim of crime, or there's been a murder, for example, and there's something on a chat that could provide evidence. So yes, in some rare circumstances they could, but it's really a bit of an unclear law at this stage that I can't give you a definitive answer about yes or no.
Can police access information that isn't public by asking the provider or by outright hacking me? Stuff like private chats, or like say TikTok has drafts of video, that sort of thing.
Well, that would require some form of warrant to do that. And in certain circumstances, they could. I mean, police do have quite sophisticated mobile phone extraction technology, and it is used at certain times, for example, to take the extreme, a pending terrorist attack, for example. But it shouldn't be used lightly, and police have to justify to a court why they are requiring to extract that information.
When can police take action for public intoxication?
The law provides a specific definition for intoxication. So just because someone has a few drinks and is tipsy does not mean that they are intoxicated in the eyes of the law. It generally requires the person's speech, balance, or coordination to be noticeably affected. So they're looking at things like, is the person stumbling around? And there's a specific legal criteria for it. It is not an offense to be intoxicated in a public place. However, if the person is conducting themselves in an offensive manner, they may have committed an offense, and it's called offensive conduct. The courts interpret whether or not a person have engaged in offensive conduct by reference to a reasonable person, whether a reasonable person would be offended by the particular conduct.
How and when can ARC Legal, Marrickville and Redfern Community Legal Centres help students?
We typically don't give advice about complex criminal matters. We lost a team member. We didn't lose him, he retired during lockdown. So we used to have a dedicated lawyer who did all of our criminal and court work. But since he's gone, we've kind of got a gap in that information. So we can't represent in court at the moment, but we can definitely advise on rights and challenging fines and making complaints about police and all of those kinds of things. And to get in touch with us, you can just go to the help section of the ARC website. And I also mentioned before, any kind of immigration matters. We have a staff member who can assist with all of those things as well. And then just in general legal advice, tenancy, Centrelink, employment, all of those fun topics. And we also have the added benefit of assisting students with anything UNSW related. So misconduct, so any kind of issues with security or protests on campus and that kind of thing, we can assist with that as well.
At Marrickville, we provide a youth legal service, and we assist all young persons under the age of 25, anyone who lives in New South Wales, and we cover most areas of law. Most of the time we were able to, at the very least, provide young persons with advice. In some cases, we assist them with tasks like completing court forms or lodging a police complaint, and in certain cases, court representation. The best way to get in touch if you need legal assistance or if you know someone who requires help is to complete a web inquiry on our website.
Redfern Legal is a free service like Marrickville Legal Centre. My practice, the police accountability practice, is also New South Wales wide. We have no age limit. We do cover things like fines if you need fines advice, and anything to do with policing, come to me. We also have other practices. We have an international students practice. We have an employment law practice. We have a credit and debt practice. I'm sure I'm missing something, but it's a free service. There's also a lot on our website, free fact sheets. Please have a look at them. They cover a lot of topic areas. And yeah, if you just need some legal advice, then just pick up the phone or fill in the web form, and we will do our best to book you in.
Is there anything that you guys think, this is directed to everyone, anything that you think students should know that we didn't get a chance to mention just now?
Just to touch, I always find that, sometimes there's a feeling of embarrassment or shame around any policing or criminal law issues. And sometimes it's hard to take that leap to get legal advice. But I just want to put it out there that that doesn't concern us. We welcome everyone to the service, and so many people are touched by these issues that you're not the only one out there, and it's best to not put your head in the sand and obtain legal advice as soon as you can. What would happen if you did not consent to a strip search? Really good question. Look, two things could happen. One is that police may not do the search, but unfortunately, I think the more likely thing is that police will continue on with the search anyway. So sometimes with police matters, it's not a matter that you can do, unfortunately, much at the time. And this is the real frustrating part, is that you may only do something after the incident has happened and caused you some trauma. But as I said, if something like that has happened to you, write down what happened, the date, the time, even a description of the officer, what they look like, and come to a legal centre like ours to get legal advice, and we'll be able to assist.
Can I also say that the importance of not consenting to searches is because even if the police did not have a lawful basis to search someone, if someone consents, too bad, the police would have a lawful basis to do so. So it's important not to consent even if the police are going to search you anyway.
That's right. It's a really good point. Once you consent to a search, what people don't know is that police no longer have to meet a legal threshold called reasonable suspicion. So again, if there's any takeaways from this seminar, is to tell police, turn on your body-worn video footage, say I don't consent, and then just say I don't have anything further to add.
So how do you tell a police officer is an actual police officer who's undercover?
Because the police officer is undercover, it's very hard to know who is a police officer. The police officers generally should identify themselves. So if they're going to exercise any of their police powers, they really should be providing you with their name and the police station that they are based at. Often they carry around identification cards as well. And if they're undercover, they often just flash it. They often do it very quickly. So it's very difficult to see, and to read any of the details on their identification card. If you're unsure and if you're concerned that the person is not a legitimate police officer, you could always call 000. And what generally happens is they'll send a police car with uniformed police officers there to check out the situation.
If you forget your student ID when using your concession opal card, can the transport officers or police fine you?
Yes, they can, because I forget the wording, but it's that you have proof of entitlement and not that you're actually entitled. So you need to carry it with you. Same with your license. When I was growing up, there was that rumor that as long as you presented a license within 24 hours, you wouldn't get booked. That's not true, people. Carry it with you.
But you can appeal fines. So even if you have been fined, you can come to Redfern Legal Centre and probably Marrickville Legal Centre to see if you could lodge an appeal of that fine or even try and seek some reduction of the fine. So just because you've got the fine, don't think that's the end of the story. And another note is that transport officers' powers are very limited. They can't use the force against you. So if there's any force against you in regards to that fine, then again, seek legal advice.
You can also email your local MP. I know that local MPs, state MPs for concession cards and fines from New South Wales can do representations to ministers. So, that's definitely another avenue worth checking out.